So my name is Brian Straniti, and I'm the Outreach and Engagement Manager with the Dutchess Land Conservancy. Thank you all for joining us on our fourth webinar in our Earth Matters series. We're really excited for our guest presenter tonight, Becca Rodomsky-Bish. But first, let's go over some basic Zoom information about tonight's webinar, followed by a brief introduction to the DLC, this program, and tonight's presenter. First, you are muted to ensure that there's no interruption during the presentation. Second, the raise hand function is disabled and all questions can be entered in the Q&A box. These questions can be submitted at any point during the presentation by accessing the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and will be addressed when our presenter is finished or answered by our team during the presentation if possible. Third, chat is disabled for this event. Fourth, closed captioning is enabled for this event. To turn on this function, locate the CC button on the bottom right hand of your screen. And finally, I will turn the mic over to Julie Hart, our Director of Education, who will tell you a bit about the Dutchess Land Conservancy, this webinar series, and our guest presenter for tonight. Julie.
Thank you, Brian. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Julie Hart, an ecologist and educator here at the Dutchess Land Conservancy. Many of you are probably familiar with the DLC, but for anyone who's not, let me give you a quick overview. Dutchess Land Conservancy is a private nonprofit land conservation organization located in the Hudson Valley of New York State, and we're dedicated to preserving the farms, forests, wetlands and waterways, open spaces and wildlife habitats of Dutchess County. We are an accredited land trust, and since our founding in 1985, we have worked with hundreds of landowners and protected over 44,000 acres of land. We're so excited that you can be here for our first season of Earth Matters, the DLC's new winter webinar series, which happens on the first Wednesday of each month from November through April. This year's webinars consider the question of how we can improve habitat around our homes to support wildlife. Our expert speakers discuss topics related to native and invasive plants and the role they play in the lives of insects, birds, pollinators, and other wildlife. We hope you'll be inspired to learn how we, as stewards of the land, can make choices that will make our own landscapes more ecologically friendly to all the species that call it home. Many thanks to the Molly B. Schaefer Education Fund for sponsoring this event. And I want to give a special shout out to Lisa Lott-Vince, the DLC's wonderful volunteer. Without her dedication and enthusiasm, these programs would not have been possible. So let's get started. Tonight, we're thrilled to welcome Becca Rodomsky-Bish from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology as our speaker. Becca's background is in environmental education, and she's involved in two projects, NestQuest Go and the Great Backyard Bird Count. NestQuest Go is a crowdsourced project that engages citizen scientists to help transcribe a historic collection of nest records to better understand the lives of nesting birds and how bird populations have changed over time. And the Great Backyard Bird Count is an annual February event coming up soon that has united bird watchers from around the world for over 20 years. For one weekend in February, this year it's the 18th to the 22nd, citizen science submit bird observations from their home or community. And by the way, the DLC is having a contest to encourage participation in the Great Backyard Bird Count. So if you share your checklist with us when you submit it to eBird, you could win some fun DLC prizes. So check our Facebook page for details on how you can enter that contest. The Great Backyard Bird Count is a fantastic way to engage backyard bird watchers and help guide people in creating bird-friendly homes and yards. And that's why we're here tonight. So with that, I'll turn it over to Becca to teach us more about the challenges birds face and how our yards can help. Becca?
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you, Julie and Brian. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here tonight to speak with you all. Thank you so much for the invitation. And welcome everybody who is tuning in tonight. I don't know about all of you, but I do spend quite a bit of my day on Zoom. So it is good of you to continue in that here in the evening time and join us in this conversation. So as Julie articulated, I am involved in two projects at the lab. Previous to those two projects, I worked on a project that really focused on this question of how can we create habitat in and around our homes and communities to really support our bird populations. So I'm going to be pulling a lot of that information in tonight. And at the end of the talk, if you want to discuss the Great Backyard Bird Count or NestQuest Go, I'm happy to talk about that work as well. But we'll start with this adorable little picture, at least I find it adorable, of a yellow-rumped warbler here. These are lovely warblers that are one of the latest migrants to move through. I'm in upstate New York, just southeast of Ithaca. So not too far away from you all. And this little warbler often passes through in my area in sometimes November, and I've even seen it in early December. They usually head further south for the winter time in the warmer climates, but this little one happened to get caught in a bit of an early snowstorm. And I am happy to report finds lots of food to eat in my backyard. I see them frequently, especially during migration. So we're going to be talking tonight a little bit about how you might too be able to support more of these little birds year round, as well as migrants. So most of you are here tonight because you love birds, right? You find them beautiful, you find them charismatic and very easy to just spend half the day watching. And I share that sentiment. And the good news about that is that what we plant in and around our communities and our homes can have a big impact on birds. And what we don't plant can also have a big impact on birds. So I'm aiming towards having a positive impact and planting as much as I can to support these birds that I love to share my space with, or rather, I'm privileged enough to be in their space and seeing them. But the news right now in terms of bird populations is not so far off from some of the other reports about biodiversity on our planet. And that is that the biodiversity is going down. We are losing birds at an unprecedented rate. You may have seen this graph because in 2019, when this paper was published by Ken Rosenberg and Adrian Dockert from the Cornell lab, they were very clear in saying that we have lost almost 3 billion birds since 1970. And I happened to be in a building where lots of ornithologists were floored by these results. When they started crunching the data, they didn't know what they were going to find. They used several long-term big data sets to find these results, and even the scientists themselves were shocked. So within this report, they were able to share these results, but perhaps more importantly, they were able to share insights on why this is happening. And tonight I will talk about why this is happening with an angle towards what we can do about it. So one of the main findings in this report addressed the impacts of deforestation. And since between 2010 and 2020, we've lost net 11.6 million acres of forest. That's an immense amount of forest habitat. So any kind of bird that is going to be looking for forests, particularly the boreal forests have been hit hard, is going to be impacted by that loss, right? And this happens to be one of my personal favorite birds. We sometimes get them down here, especially during eruptive years, which I haven't seen them this year. They're not quite erupting, which isn't a bad thing because that means they are getting the resources they need in their habitat they prefer to be in further north. But we've lost 9 in 10 evening grosbeaks since 1970. That's an immense amount for such a beautiful, special bird. Agriculture and urbanization are also having a big impact on bird populations for lots of reasons, right? They're losing native meadows and fields and habitat, and what they feed on that comes along with that, which is insects and insect biodiversity. And so that lack of insects and lack of habitat is having a huge impact on many of our grassland birds. And I know that your land trust is very devoted to trying to maintain grasslands and meadows for birds. Eastern meadowlarks in particular have been hit very hard. We have lost 3 out of 4 since the 1970s. And I have a personal testament to this. I maintain fields and grasslands on my property. When I moved to this property 14 years ago, we had meadowlarks, and we don't have them now. I have not been able to spot them in the last 3 or 4 years, and it's very disheartening, even though I'm managing for them. A lot of the properties around me aren't, and so they're not able to survive, and I hope they come back. I keep hoping I'm going to see them. One of the ways we can counteract that is in terms of the agriculture is we can support local farms. And this goes for agriculture and forest, right? Because this farmer here is growing an intense amount of crop in a small space using manual instead of large agricultural equipment. And if you notice in the background, there is some native habitat being maintained there. So there is nothing to there's nothing I can say to overemphasize the importance of how we get our food, who we get our food from, can have a direct impact on helping birds. If you are supporting local farmers who are managing their land sustainably, who are maintaining habitat for birds in addition to farm, you're going to do a lot for birds. Toxic pesticides is also a large problem on a lot of these large farms. And predominantly it's because a lot of those pesticides are getting rid of the pests. And then birds that need those pests, in quotes, I will say, are not able to find enough food to support themselves. So we see this pressure immensely in swallows and swifts and other flycatchers, other aerial insectivores are just not able to find as much food as they could previous to 1970. So that is a big pressure. So again, supporting local farmers who aren't using pesticides is a great way to go. Farmers markets are generally inundated with farmers that are growing this way. And if you just can't get to a farmer's market or don't have them, looking for that organic label is huge. Anytime you purchase an organic product, you are purchasing from a farm that is devoted to minimizing their use of pesticides and toxic chemicals. Loss of habitat due to development. This is nothing new. Many of us know that we do like to build our buildings in our cities and our communities, and that has its pros and cons in terms of its impact on birds. But probably one of the biggest impacts that we're seeing is on the migratory bird population in terms of our development. And the reason is this. If you are looking at this right now and seeing beautiful clouds and think you could almost fly into that window, that is indeed what the birds are seeing. And so a lot of our structures that we put up, if we don't actually put things on the windows or protect our windows, the birds get very confused and will fly into these. And one of the reasons why cities are particularly problematic is because at nighttime, when these birds are migrating, they see these light epicenters, right? And they say, wow, look at that light. I'm curious. And they fly down into them. They're not hitting the windows at night. A lot of people get confused about this. They're generally not hitting windows at night, but they're flying into the light and they're finding a tree or a shrub or some other area that they can hunker down until the next morning. And then I don't think I can go backwards, and then in the morning, they're going to wake up and they're going to see those windows that look like this, that look like clouds. And that is when they're going to collide, is usually the next day. And so they might be on their migration point and end up in a city because they get lured in, and then they just can't figure out how to get out because they're surrounded by these windows that look like what they're used to seeing. So window collisions are a big problem. About 1 billion birds a year or so hit windows. In terms of migration, many of you might be aware that a lot of the songbirds are very heavily impacted by window collisions. And one of the main reasons, if you look at this graph visual, is because they migrate much lower than, say, waterfowl. Waterfowl can collide with towers and tall buildings, but it's not as common as our songbird population because they migrate a little bit higher. And as you look at this graphic, you can see how the good and the bad news is that, there's a lot of impacts happening. This is the bad news. The good news is that there are aspects that we can take some action on beyond that's within our power and control to minimize those impacts. So 253 million is no small number in terms of residences where birds are impacting. So if we can help people know how to protect windows so that birds aren't colliding, then we can lower the number of collisions. And then if we work in big buildings, we can also be sort of power thinkers in terms of encouraging the businesses and communities to turn off lights, turn down lights, especially during migration. Now, I realize a lot of the things in between there, between power lines and communication towers and turbines, we don't have as much direct power to influence and shift, but just knowing sort of the impact of that structure is important so we can support policies and legislations to help protect birds. Peak migration happens here in our region in the spring and the fall, obviously, and we actually get a little more migration action in the fall than the spring. A lot of the spring migration goes up more in the central states, in the Midwest, and a lot of those birds sometimes migrate back via us on the coast or closer to the coast. So we have kind of a bigger fall migration, but knowing when migration happens, and I'm going to show you some tools at the end to learn more about that, is really important in protecting birds. And during migration seasons in particular, really turning off our lights in our homes and our businesses and or dimming our lights during 11 to 6 is really important. Draw your blinds, get the light pollution and exposure down in your community to help the birds navigate and not be pulled into the light. Turn those lights off as much as possible. And then outside floodlights are incredibly important because those generally tend to be very strong lights. So turning them off if you can, or putting them on sensors so that they're not on unless something is moving, and then making sure those beams are pointing down and not up. Go a huge way to minimize the amount of birds that are going to be disoriented and pulled into lighting areas. One of the other easy I say in quotes, easier to do at home, not always in our businesses and communities, is to actually protect our windows. And ABC Conservation has, has lots of really wonderful links out to where you can get different types of window protections. It can be as simple as tempera paint here, where you see this beautiful fish design. You can do this with family or kids or grandkids. Paint your windows during migration. It doesn't have to be year round. Most collisions happen during the migration months. So paint your windows for the spring and the fall and try to minimize the amount of birds that are pulled in. Here's a really fun building where somebody has put up a design using sticky notes, very affordable, easy to do. Things like the tape and the decals and the Zen blinds or Zen curtains can be much more expensive. Certainly external blinds are more expensive, but they go a long way to minimizing bird collisions. And if you have noticed that there are certain birds in certain windows in your home that birds are colliding in, pay attention to that and maybe prioritize those windows to protect them so that the birds are not running into them. And then this is one of the most heated conversations that often happen with people when we're talking about bird conservation are outdoor cats. They are predators, right? They're predators that we can put in our environments, and they are hunters just by instinct. It's just what cats do. It's no fault of their own. It's just an instinctual thing. And they do kill even more birds a year than windows. So upwards of 2.4 billion in North America from free-ranging cats. And I had to throw this picture in. I was doing some searching today in Macaulay Library for images, and I saw this picture and I thought I just have to put that in. These kinds of images yank my heart. Beautiful kitty, but I'm also nervous for those ducks, right? And this was uploaded just a couple days ago outside of or along the Erie Canal in Ohio. So to me, the win-win is let's let our cats be outside, but let's build catios. So catios is kind of a hybrid of cat and patio, right? Build them a little outdoor space. I have several friends who do this and say that their cats love it. It could be as simple as a window if you're an apartment complex, or it can be something more elaborate if you have a yard or a back patio. Fence that in, let those cats have some time outside in the sunshine and listening and rolling around, but also protect our birds. And then climate change, of course, is a challenge that's affecting all life on this planet. For birds, it's really impacting migration. And of course, wildfires, when they hit and rage through areas, that impacts habitat and minimizes their ability to forage. And then, of course, it creates an immense amount of air pollution when a lot of these fires and changes happens, or floods also impact habitat for the birds. So climate change is a huge pressure on birds. And the nest record card collection, one of the things we are hoping to look at is to see how, since the 1960s, when we've been collecting that data, how birds nesting has been impacted as the climate has been changing. And we hope to be able to do some of that analysis. So here's a beautiful picture of birds hunkered together, talk about climate change. Tree swallows generally do not like to be in snowy areas. In the wintertime, if they can avoid it, they generally go south. But this little flock got caught together in a snowstorm. And while this picture is beautiful, it also makes my heart yank a little bit, because you know that those birds are struggling. And there was a pretty severe fallout, that we call them fallouts, with birds during migration in 2020. It was mostly in the Southwest, and it was a kind of one of those cumulative, very climate change based issues that occurred. There were fires happening in California and the West, which were throwing birds off of their migration a little bit, because they were struggling to migrate the routes they normally did. So they got thrown off course. And then there was a very cold system that was a bit of a freak system. I actually heard that there is another cold system moving through Texas here very soon. Fortunately, we're not in mass migration right now. But this cold system moved in an area where it's very unusual, and the birds were unable to forage and get enough food to resupply the energy intensive requirements that they have during migration. And so literally birds were falling out of the sky. They just didn't have the fuel to keep going. So it was this very bizarre occurrence, but these do happen, and climate change and the pressures that birds are facing are a part of why these things are happening. So I want to start moving into the good news. And I hope you're not all depressed and decided to tune out, because there is a lot of good news coming. That's the bad news. The good news is we have seen gains in birds. So there's been a net loss of almost 3 billion, but certain birds we have gained in their population. And waterfowl is one of them. We have gained about 35 million different species of waterfowl, which is an immense amount. And guess what? The reason is because of us, because of our conservation actions. We've taken really rigorous action since 1970 to preserve wetland habitat, to put restrictions and legislation on it, so we can't just build wherever we want to build, whenever we want to build, right? We are preserving wetlands, we're rehabilitating wetlands. And so because of that, the waterfowl have come back. We've also seen a huge gain in woodpeckers, more than 14 million since 1970. So their populations are on the rise. And I hear this anecdotally from people who are watching bird feeders. I have so many Harrys. I have so many downy woodpeckers this year. And it's true, the populations are growing. And one of the main reasons is because we've figured out how important our forests are, in particular as it relates to dead trees. So there was a mass movement for a while there in state and forest lands to just get those dead trees out to minimize the risk of fire and pests that were maybe problematic on some of those trees. And since then, we've been able to kind of study the science and say, whoa, taking those dead trees out is not a good idea. They have an ecological benefit oftentimes where they are, and primary nesting cavity birds like woodpeckers need to forage on them and build nests in them. And so because of these changes in how we are managing large tracts of land, we are seeing impacts that are positive in terms of bird conservation, which is wonderful. But here is the even better news. We can all be doing something about this individually at home. And I referenced that I've lived in this area about 14 years, but I didn't live on this particular property that entire time. I moved back to the property I live on. This is an aerial from my upstairs room of one section of my property that I started to rehabilitate and turn back to native landscape, as well as vegetable farming, because I am an organic vegetable farmer as well, in 2018. And so my gardens aren't that old, but they are abundant, and they are getting more abundant each year. And the benefit of that is that this is something we can all do. And you could do this on a small piece of land or a big piece of land. It doesn't matter how big your size is. You can be doing what you can to create and maintain native habitat. And the good news about that is that the birds notice and they prefer it. This was a study done in 2020, specifically looking at migratory hermit thrushes, and they were able to study the scat in these birds' excrement and figure out that even when presented with equal amounts of native plants versus non-native, like this Rosa multiflora that you see pictured, they're going to go for the native stuff. Higher percentage and ratio of fruit and seeds in the scat from native plants. So the birds know, and the birds are paying attention. And so even though we may have food for them, they are going to prefer the native stuff. This is another section of my garden, again, a pretty young section. You can see I'm not 100% purist native. I do love my irises and gladiolas. I'm a very big grower of all sorts of things, but the vast majority of what you see here is native, and it's a pollinator patch that's surrounding my raised beds, one of my raised bed gardens here where I grow a lot of vegetables. And this is kind of that same general look, closer to the early summer time, where you have some yarrows, you have some Moderna bee balm growing in here, Coreopsis. I do still have my irises. And then we have goldenrods that won't be flowering for a little while longer. So it can be done big or small, and you're going to see huge biodiversity gains when you do choose to go native. And there's great news about native plants. Anybody who's grown them knows that they are very easy to grow. They're sometimes so easy to grow that you find yourself overwhelmed with how to manage them, right? They establish quickly, they get big quickly. And the most important thing about them, well, one of the most important things about them is that they provide for the wildlife when the wildlife need it, right? The seeds come in when the wildlife need the seeds, the fruit come in, the caterpillars come in, et cetera, et cetera. So native gardens really are feeding a larger total ecosystem if we let them and encourage them to do so. And there's not a lot of research on this, but there is some that wildlife actually use native plants for medicinal properties. So if they're struggling from different fungal or bacterial infections, there is evidence that they will seek out certain types of plants in order to counteract some of that. And I'm going to show you a plant specifically that bumblebees have been, they've done research on this. So native plants are really important, and the wildlife need them, including birds, very much so. But probably one of the most important reasons why birds need a native habitat is this. Native plants are the larval hosts for our native moths and butterflies. And I believe you all have heard Doug Ptolemy in this series, and he is sort of the master of this, right? This is his big stick, is if we want birds, we got to have moths and butterfly larvae in the form of caterpillars. And it's true. This is a Baltimore Oriole hunting. It found a nice fat caterpillar here, and it's going to take it back, likely to feed its offspring. And not a lot of people realize this, but 98% of all North American songbirds feed their young caterpillars from moths and butterflies. Even if they're eating seeds at your feeder, they can't feed those. Not all species, there are some exceptions, like the American goldfinch can feed seeds to their young, but the vast majority are feeding them caterpillars. And so if we want to have caterpillars so that birds can raise more offspring, we need to have native plants that those insects can lay their eggs on. And here's a pretty startling statistic. This is actually a conservative number. Doug Ptolemy, I've heard him talk this up to closer to 9,000. But a single pair of chickadees, which happens to be one of Doug Ptolemy's study subjects, can require upwards of 7,500 to 9,000 caterpillars to rear one clutch of eggs in a season. And for those of you that know chickadees, know that they sometimes will raise 2 clutches, sometimes 3, right? So multiply that out, and that is a lot of caterpillars. If they don't have the food to do that, then they're going to struggle to have babies, young, that are fit and have enough nutrients to be able to be viable birds. So we really, when we put native plants in, we're really feeding the baby birds. And I'm going to interject some pollinator pictures too. This is a picture of a pollinator on nectarine on milkweed. And this is a butterfly that's native to this area, a Baltimore checkered spot. They are just beautiful. If you've never seen one, they are lovely. And while it can nectar on pretty much anything, it really needs specific host plants to lay its eggs. And this is true for a lot of different butterflies. You probably know the pretty common monarch milkweed relationship, right? Well, this is similar with the Baltimore checkered spot, and it likes to feed on, lay its eggs on white turtlehead. It's looking specifically for this plant in its ecosystem in order to lay its eggs. And I'm happy to report that I aggressively put this in myself. Didn't see checkered spots for a year or so, but the following year I did, and now I see them every season, right? So if we put these plants in, literally the animals will come. They will find them if they are in the area already. And this happens to be, white turtlehead happens to be a plant that a researcher out of the University of Vermont has actually studied, that it has a medicinal property for bumblebees. And I can attest to this. My bumblebees love this plant, and they are always pushing into those petals and getting deep inside there. And there's a medicinal property that helps to fight some fungal infections that the bumblebees sometimes get in the fall. So these plants have multiple benefits, and that's why the natives are indeed so important. So if we're feeding our pollinators and we're providing habitat for our pollinators, like butterflies and moths to lay eggs on, we are helping the birds. Here's a beautiful chickadee again on an oak. And I would be remiss if I did not plug Doug a little bit more. He has written 2 lovely books that I highly recommend if this topic is of interest to you. He is definitely a sage and a guru when it comes to these concepts. And as you know, probably his big powerhouse plant is oaks. So if you can establish and encourage oaks in and around your habitat as a part of what you're growing, you're going to do a lot of benefit for birds and pollinators, moths and butterflies. It is estimated based on Doug's research that oak trees in general in North America, this is all of North America, can support about 4,000 different types of insects and animals. That's more than any other species of tree, a species of plant. So I always tell people we can't all plant trees depending on how big or small our properties are. If you can plant trees, go oaks. And sometimes you can maybe have a space for a smaller oak, maybe like a scrub oak that doesn't get quite as big and becomes a little more shrub-like in its growth pattern. So trying to think about how to integrate oaks if they're not already in your landscape is a great thing to support birds. But not just oaks. There's lots of things that we can plant to support birds. So I'm going to give you a series of slides here of different types of plants. I'm going to start with more small tree shrub-like plants, and then we're going to go into forbs and look at some flowers that you can consider making sure you have in your landscape. This is a beautiful house wren perched on probably a plant you all are very familiar with. They're very common in New York State. This is Juneberry. It goes by lots of different names, serviceberry, Juneberry, etc. And I do have the scientific names up on these. I am not a formally trained botanist, so most of my plant learning has come through the birds and through common names. So I'm going to lean into common names, but I do provide the Latin names for you all. And it might surprise you that the reason why this is a good pollinator and bird plant is because of those early flowers. And it's not because of nectar, although the nectar is helpful for pollinators. It's because this little house wren, when it moves into my area, because they're not here in the winter, it's looking for insects. It's looking for small insects to hunt. And those insects, guess what? They're feeding on the flowers, right? So these birds, especially when they show up and they're very nutrient deprived from their migration, they're going to look for the insects and they're going to find them on the early flowering plants. And this is one of the early flowering trees and shrubs in my region, and perhaps down closer to where you are in the Hudson Valley. So this little wren is going to land, hunt around, and hope to grab a delicious meal. This is a Swainson's thrush. Any kind of thrush loves berries for the most part, and it's landed in a red elderberry. There are red elderberry and purple elderberry species. Both of them are powerhouses for birds. I mostly grow the purples because I harvest the fruit if I can get to it before the birds, which is very hard to do. They will watch these plants and they will devour the berries, sometimes even before they're totally ripe. But I harvest the fruit from a purple elderberry that I grow because I make a medicinal cough syrup for my family from it every year. And this is another plant where there's evidence that medicinally these birds are getting a lot of antioxidants from elderberry. It's a very high antioxidant plant, and they often will sort of gorge out on these during migration, right before migration and during migration. So real energy powerhouses for birds. And it also produces a beautiful, almost Queen Anne's lace-like flower earlier in the season that pollinators also really love. This is one of my personal favorite shrubs. I have it all over my property. It's not in the picture that I have here. This picture that I am in front of is part of my rain garden. But one of the first gardens I put in when I started to rehabilitate this land was red osier dogwoods. I put in a large amount. They do really well in wet. They're very tolerant of it. They'll also tolerate dry, but they generally like to be a little bit moist. And they produce beautiful flowers, beautiful white flowers relatively early in the season, and then these awesome white berries. And you will not see the berries for long. They are consumed very quickly by robins and waxwings and juncos. I've even seen eating these fruits. So really a wonderful shrub. Highly recommend adding some red osier dogwood. There are different color variations. I have a yellow version, which is a nativar, and I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. So you can get different colors, but I really love the native red is my preference. Here's a adorable, one of my favorite birds, a gray catbird on sweet viburnums. Any species of viburnum is a great call. They all produce really beautiful, delicious fruits that birds love, and generally many of them have really beautiful foliage in the fall if you're looking for foliage color in your property. Catbirds are also a little bit of a later migrant. I've had them hanging around well into September and sometimes October. I can always tell when they're gone because I don't hear them calling anymore. They have such a lovely bird call, which is what they're known. Their name is sort of from catbird. So any kind of a viburnum that you can add to your property. I also have a viburnum that its common name is American cranberry. It also produces a beautiful red fruit. So any kind of a viburnum is a good call. Here's an American goldfinch on Winterberry, another one of my favorite shrubs. And my Winterberry actually right now still have lots of berries on them. It looks very much like this picture. And one of the reasons why they haven't been consumed yet is because the taste and quality of those berries just continues to increase. And so a lot of the birds will leave these till the very end. Sometimes right during that cusp between winter and spring, they'll finally kind of consume the Winterberries as sort of their last resort food. Really high in nutrition, and kind of like wine, those berries just age in flavor over time, and the birds know that, and they will hold off and eat other things. And then when they really know that they're going to be delicious, they will devour them within a day. It's very amazing to watch a flock move in and just gobble these up. Moving into some forbs. This is one of my favorite early flowering forbs. This is a eastern red columbine with a ruby-throated hummingbird. Hummingbirds are not in my area year-round, generally probably not in yours either. They tend to go south into the warmer climates. They really need nectar and flowering plants to survive the winter, which we don't have a lot of up here right now. This is the native coloration. It's kind of got that salmon color with the yellow center. This is the true native columbine. And I am going to talk about nativars briefly, but this is a highly hybridized plant. You can get lots of beautiful columbine, and yes, they are all beautiful, but if you're really looking to support native wildlife and birds, stick to this particular color variety if you can find it, because it is the best in terms of supporting hummingbirds and other nectar seeking pollinators. Here are two more of my favorites. I mentioned Monarda in another slide. This is the red Oswego tea, also called bee balm version. Hummingbirds love this plant. If you love hummingbirds, you will have hummingbirds finding these plants. And they also very much love cardinal flower. Cardinal flower is a wonderful plant that grows relatively tall, so you got to have some height freedom for this plant, and it produces these beautiful red flowers. It really loves its feet wet, so this is a great option if you have a very wet property or if you have a rain garden. Make sure that it has some cardinal flower in it. Hummingbirds love it. You could sit in front of this plant some distance away and just watch the hummingbirds come and go. They'll feed on it all day. American goldfinch here on purple coneflower. Now, purple coneflower, depending on who you're talking to in terms of habitat gardening, some habitat enthusiasts love it and some don't. And I will talk about why in the next slide. But purple coneflower in general, I do have on my property. I don't have an abundance of it, but I do keep some of it. It does have beautiful heads. Those seed heads that you see in this image will dry and turn into a great food resource for the birds in the fall and the winter, and into the early spring as well, if they're still if they're still on the plants and not consumed, and they are a well-loved plant by pollinators and butterflies. The tricky part about purple coneflower and some other natives like phlox is that they are highly bred. They're highly hybridized. So this term is becoming more popular in the habitat gardening world, this concept of a nativar, which means it was an original native, there was an original native wild type, but we have bred it to have certain features. And in this particular example, this is called the mac and cheese echinacea or purple coneflower. Echinacea is the Latin, and it has a very, very big seed head there, and it has yellow petals instead of more of the magenta purple. So this is a native plant, but it is a nativar plant because it has been cultivated in order to have some kind of a genetic difference or feature. A lot of times we do that because we want it maybe to not be purple, right? We want it to be yellow, or we want the plant to be bigger, or we want it to be able to tolerate extreme wet areas or extreme dry areas, right? So there's lots of reasons why we breed plants, but it hasn't been well researched whether they have the same ecological benefit. Doug Ptolemy has done a little bit of research on this. There's a researcher out of University of Vermont who's also looked at this, and the evidence points to two things. First, it's species dependent. So when we're looking at whether nativars are just as good or not, we have to really look at the species level to know the answer to that. And it appears that some plants are just as good, if not better, in terms of their ecological benefit for wildlife, birds and pollinators, and some of them are not as beneficial. And so what I always encourage people to do, if you're really, really, really want to try and support maximal wildlife, try and stay away from cultivars, nativars, excuse me, and really lean into the native wild types, and ask your nurseries what they're growing, because they can answer that question pretty easily for you. So getting back into a little more of the forbs that are really beneficial, this is false sunflower. This gets very big. It tolerates more dry, moist to dry areas. And it is another powerhouse plant, has lots and lots of bees on it all year round when it's flowering. And then it produces a lot of beautiful seeds that the birds are still eating in my garden right now. Joe pieweed is another one, tall plant, will spread and get pretty abundant, but it's wonderful. Pollinators love it, birds love it, produces lots of seeds and lots of nectar. It also likes wetter feet. It can tolerate drier, but it generally is a good one for wet areas. Goldenrod, here's a Nashville warbler on goldenrod. Again, this is a migrant bird. And it's probably landing on this goldenrod for the same reason the house wren was landing on the serviceberry or the Juneberry, because it's looking for insects, right? Warblers are predominantly insect-eating birds. And so when it's moving through and maybe the blossoms in general are going down and they're having a hard time foraging, they'll land on flowers hoping to find a spider or a bee or some other type of insect that they can predate upon. So goldenrod, this is another one that gets a little bit of a bad rap for being something that really takes over. Some species do. There are several species of goldenrod that are very easy to contain. And so if you have a small space and you don't want to go big with your goldenrod, I recommend gray goldenrod. Zigzag goldenrod is probably my favorite one, has awesome growth pattern, and they will not spread and they will not take over. So having some goldenrod in your property is really important for late migrants and late pollinators, but you can be specific about what kinds you grow if you don't have a lot of space for it to expand. Another late season flowering plant is New England Asters, and there's lots of different asters. These are also another one that have been hybridized a lot, but there's also several different types of native varieties. And northern cardinals love the little seeds that are produced on New England Asters, as well as the bees really love asters, because sometimes asters even last longer than goldenrod. And so they really provide a very reliable late season nectar source for the pollinators and a feeding source for the birds all through the winter, really. So moving into some sort of larger concepts, those are some plants that you could specifically target and look at if you don't already have them in your landscape, but kind of taking a bigger step out. When I create my gardens and when I recommend gardens to people, I really encourage these three things: planted diverse garden, plant it dense, and plant it layered. And that is for ecological reasons, right? This is in my previous position, we would create landscape garden recommendations for people and give them specific native plant recommendations. And then we would create this artistry of how it might look once it's in full bloom. And obviously not all of these are going to bloom at the same time, but we do this just for the artistic effect. And this particular client had a shady area. As you can see, it's in a forested spot already. So they didn't need trees. If there were no trees there, then I would definitely have a tree in my recommendation or a couple of them, but they already had the trees and they needed middle story, lower story, and ground covers, right? And so we were able to kind of create a palette for them and lay out different recommendations that we have, but really keeping to this idea of diverse, dense, and layered helps provide maximal foraging areas for birds, right? So birds that like to maybe forage a little higher, like your warblers and your thrushes, they might find some resources here. Those that are kind of your middle story foragers, like your goldfinch and your cardinals, are going to find something here. And then your ground birds, like your juncos, are going to find something here, right? So we're really trying to create habitat layers where we can maximally encourage birds and pollinators into our habitat. And it's also pretty. And it makes for a lot less weeding, especially that dense part. If you plant densely, you're not going to have to weed as much, which is always a bonus. And then when you go to start really getting into this, it's super important to understand where you live, because where you live will impact what is native to where you live, right, in terms of plants. And so if you look at New York here on this map, we have 5 or 6 different what are called ecoregions. These are different than planting zones. Planting zones are great. That's kind of the more traditional concept of growing that we lean into. And it's good to know because it's good to know what temperature range plants can tolerate. But an ecoregion is more specific, and it really gets into what wildlife live there and what plants can really live there. And as you can see on this map, you all might live in an ecoregion that's different from mine. That blue color here kind of overlaps. There's probably several different ecoregions for people that are on this call tonight in this one area, right? And so really knowing where you live and what can grow there is a key to your success, both in terms of attracting wildlife and the success of your plants themselves. And there's some beautiful resources to make this easy for you. You can see there's a URL in the top here, which is where you can get access to what I'm going to show you right now. So Pollinator Partnership has produced these incredible guides. If you have not checked them out, I highly recommend you do this. You can just enter in your zip code here for both the United States and Canada. Pretty much every place is covered in terms of having resources. So you type in your zip code, and then this beautiful personalized to your ecoregion booklet is produced. It's a PDF, and you can download this, keep it on your computer, or print a copy off. It's about 22 to 24 pages, really in-depth information. It will tell you what kind of native plants to make sure you have, what kinds of animals that they will support birds and butterflies and so forth. And it just is dense and full. It also gives you the benefit of telling you when they're blooming and sometimes what colors they are. They don't have it. It's not, all colors are not included, but it really does a good job giving you the names of plants, what they support, and what time of year they provide resources. Another resource that you may have seen in other presentations is the Audubon Native Plant Database. Highly recommend this one as well. I use sometimes three or four different resources when I'm doing this work for my property or if I'm making recommendations to other people. What's really beneficial about the Audubon database is that within this database, it will specifically help you understand what different plants support different types of birds. So you can see over here that serviceberry that I showed you is pulled up here. And these are some of the birds that might forage off of that serviceberry, either the fruit or the insects that are attracted to it. It gives you some descriptions about the plant itself and some of its attributes. And then it has this really lovely buy now. It has resources on their website so you can know where to go to get these plants. And that is probably one of the number one questions that I get. How do I find where native plants are? And this tool is one place that will help you with that. And all of the resources that they give you in terms of nurseries. I highly recommend you calling those nurseries. Some of them carry 25% native plants and some carry 75. Very rarely do they carry 100%, but if they're in this database, they carry some percentage of native plants. So call them, ask them what they have, and then make your decision about whether you want to go visit. For those of you on the call who are maybe already further along in this process, maybe you're already doing a lot of native planting and you want to kind of go even deeper. This is a resource, and I did give Julie and Brian a copy of this in an Excel spreadsheet that you can kind of build your own if you are interested in what I'm going to present. But this is called a planting palette. And what's really fun about this is you can get kind of a flat snapshot of what your garden is doing when it's doing it. And so we'll walk through this a little bit together. Over here on this side, we have listed out, and these are charts that I used to put together when I was doing specific garden recommendations. So this is an example from actually the image that I showed you earlier. So the plants that I recommended are going to support these types of species, a couple of different butterflies up here and moths, hummingbirds and bees, and even some of those recommendations provided good shelter for salamanders and so forth. So over to the left are sort of the species that we're going to support, and it's broken out based on trees and shrubs, grasses, flowers, forbs, and then ground covers here. And then here we're going to have the common names. Let's zoom in here. We're going to have the common names with the scientific names. And then your color chart here is going to kind of tell you what resources are provided at what times. So are there flowers available and hence nectar? Are there flowers and fruit available? Because sometimes there's an overlap there, right? Is there only fruits and seeds available at that time? And are the fruits and seeds then dried? So if we look in the middle, we can chart this out based on the calendar. And in our region, most of us aren't probably going to have too much in terms of flowers and such in March, but there are a lot of plants that will start to flower in March. And so when we look at our spreadsheet here, we can begin to ask ourselves, are there gaps? And I did this specifically for my gardens 2 years ago because I felt like I was just not able to support wildlife year round, and that was concerning me. And so I was able to pinpoint that I actually had some pretty serious gaps in April and May. And so I was able to really target plants that were producing something in April and May so that you can support wildlife. And as you can see, you can also color out what you are growing. For those of you that are really interested in the aesthetic of color, you can get a sense of, I got a lot of white and yellow. Can I target plants that maybe produce some pinks or purples or blues? And so you can get a little bit of a snapshot of your color palette here. And then of course, you can list out more specifically what those plants support. And then always it's important to know the spread effect, both vertically and horizontally, of how your plants are going to grow. So I think planting palettes are a lot of fun. This isn't probably something you want to jump into if you're real new to this, but after a couple of seasons, if you really want to kind of figure out what are my gardens doing well and where are the gaps, this is something I recommend doing. And even though I don't have it on here, even the brown here of the dried seeds usually pushes into March. If you have things that are still holding on to seeds in February, you're going to have some yellow over here too, which isn't reflected, but trust that you will have dried seeds probably in March if you're planting native plants. And here's a tool, again, this isn't my first go-to place recommendation, but as you get deeper into this puzzle of trying to maximize your habitat offerings, I really recommend the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. Again, the URLs are up here in the corner. You can type in the names of plants. You can do it by family and genus. You can do it, by just general common or scientific names. And what I love about this tool that is unique from some of the other tools is that you can really specify your growing area. So is it a sun? Is it a part shade? Is it a shade? Is it moist? Is it dry? Is it very wet, etc.? And then you can really fine tune the habitat and the state and the region you're in. And then this is very hard to find in a database. You can specifically target bloom time. And this is where I was able to go to fill in my early blooming gaps. I was able to say, yeah, I want something that's blooming in March, April, May. That's all I want to see. And I want to target those plants. So you can really start to focus by using this particular database and ask really specific questions of it. And it will give you very accurate results in terms of native plants. So hopefully, let me actually take a breath because you guys are probably catching up with how quickly I am talking. Hopefully, I have convinced you, if you weren't already convinced before you got on this call, that birds are fun and we want to have them in our yards, and we need to have native plants in order to support them and see them frequently in our yards. But some of you might be coming into this work more because of your love for plants and less because you know a lot about birds. So however you're entering, it's all wonderful and beautiful. But I would encourage you, if you are intentionally trying to plant for wildlife and maybe haven't paid as much attention to the birds, that you start doing that, because you will ultimately be rewarded with seeing how the types of birds and the amount of birds that you're attracting, if you continue in your native habitat work, will go up, and you will begin to see things. And so I want to provide you with some tools for those of you that maybe are less familiar with how to enter the foray of understanding birds, some tools that you can use. Probably many of you have asked this question: what birds are in my yard, right? And that the answer to that depends on the time of year a little bit, but let's say you're just curious and you want to learn some more, and you've been watching and you've been paying attention, and you probably had little phrases like this come up. Oh yeah, it had a small stripe, I think next to its eye or on its wing. Oh, it had a red top on its head, right? This is kind of how we see birds, especially when we're just entering into understanding them, or if we see a new species, right? We kind of catch these really snapshot visuals. So the lab has created a tool to help you with those snapshot visuals that you take of birds. And it's called Merlin. If those of you who are not familiar with this tool, if you have a smartphone, I highly recommend you downloading this app. It is 100% free, and it is amazing. It is constantly evolving with its AI technology. It gets better and better all the time. And it is phenomenal if you are beginning your foray, or even if you're already deep into your foray of understanding birds. It is just a wonderful tool to have literally in your pocket. And how Merlin works is really straightforward. And this is one of the reasons why in the Great Backyard Bird Count, circling back to that, we are encouraging people to enter their first IDs using Merlin, because it's so simple and it's so easy and it's so much fun. So let's say you're sitting in your backyard and you see this beauty land. Lucky you, not an easy bird to always see. So awesome that you see this beautiful streak of red, and you know it's not a cardinal, right? You're like, no, that's not a cardinal. So you can pull out your Merlin and you can tell us, actually the phone will pick it up automatically, will tell you where you are. And then if it's that particular date, it will default to that date. But if it was a couple days ago, you can change the date. So we need date, we need location. Generally, those are automatically created for you. And then you have to answer 3 questions. So what size is the bird? And we give you sort of the relative size of pretty common birds, right? Sparrow. Most of us know how big a robin is. Most of us know how big a crow is. Most of us know how big a Canada goose is, right? So you'll click relative to those, what size your bird is. And then you'll tell us what colors, and you can pick up to 3. So what are the dominant colors? And I really stress dominant here, right? Do you dominantly see black? Do you dominantly see red? We're just going to pick red and black for this one. And then where is the bird? So tell us where you saw it. And literally using the answers to these questions, 98 to 99% of the time, Merlin is going to create a list for you, and often your bird is the top one. If not the top one, it's a couple down. So with that entry, we got scarlet tanager as our first hit, rose-breasted grosbeak, and there are more, but sure enough, that was a scarlet tanager that you were lucky enough to see witnessed and perched. So Merlin is a fabulous tool that really quickly can help you get to know the birds in your yard. It has a wonderful photo ID feature. So if you are a fast photographer with your smartphone, you can take a picture, you can upload it, and with a little bit less accuracy, closer to more like 92, 80s to 90% with your picture, we can usually ID the bird for you. And then very new, just launched last year, is Sound ID. And this is phenomenal for those of you who bird by sound, or like me, I don't bird as well by sound. So I'm learning a lot using the Sound ID feature. You can literally put your phone out and record and then save it to Merlin. And Merlin will tell you literally what birds were singing or calling. It's phenomenal. It will list them out for you automatically in real time. It's a mind-blowing tool. So Merlin, I can't stress it more. If you are new to birds or you already love birds, but you want some more help kind of identifying them. ebird is another tool. It's been around a bit longer than Merlin has been, since about 2002. It is grown exponentially, and ebird is really the powerhouse citizen science tool that we are using for bird conservation now. We have over 500,000 people from around the world who are telling us about their birds. This is one of the tools, in addition to Merlin, that you can use during the Great Backyard Bird Count. In this particular tool, you can actually list out a lot of different birds and tell us how many of them. And the amount of data that we are accumulating through ebird with ebird around the world is amazing. And with that data, we are able to then make conservation action recommendations and choices because we have the data to back it up. And let me show you what we're doing with a lot of this data. Again, here's a website if this modeling is really fascinating for you and you want to get into it more in depth. This is a ruby-crowned kinglet that bird people, watchers, enthusiasts have entered data in all over the United States and Canada and Mexico, and they have told us when they are seeing this bird. And we're talking lots of people, right? This is a lot of data points. And what we can do is create these status and trend maps where we can begin to understand where birds are when they're moving, where they concentrate when they're moving, what are their preferred migration routes. And anybody on this call who understands data and can see the beauty, it's beautiful alone, but you can see the power of having this information. And then we can make recommendations and encourage legislation to help these birds because we know where they are, when they are. And you can see over here, for those of you that are watching this beautiful artistry, this is January, this is December. So you can see how these birds are really migrating south. Really, they're late migrants, similar to the yellow-rumped warbler, and they're really heading into their southern region for the winter in November and December, and you can see how they're moving throughout the year. So these status and trend maps we have for many, many species. We don't have them for all, but the more people that ebird and do Merlin, the more data that we have, and then we can feed that into these models to better understand where birds are. Another tool that's even newer, this is one of our newest tools, is a tool called Birdcast. And this is using the power of weather radar stations. We only have this for the United States, excuse me. We're working on getting Canada, and we ultimately would like to integrate into other parts of the world as well. But as you can imagine, weather radar data is valuable, right? And not every country is willing to sort of hand over that data to us. But for right now, we have the United States pretty well mapped out. And what we can do in Birdcast, and you can see that the date here is from May of 2021, so migration in the spring last year, we can begin to understand, again, where birds are when, and what time of year, or what time of day rather, they're moving. And this can also have huge impacts on conservation efforts. And we can begin to sort of understand peak migration, and we can begin to sort of start to take action. This is a URL down here. One of the biggest, most recent things that we've been working on is working with large cities around the United States. We have a big movement in Texas that we've been doing here now for a couple of years, where we are working with large cities. In particular, Texas is a huge migration route, as you probably saw there, even with the ruby-crowned kinglet, there's a lot of activity. So at the time of year where these birds are moving through, why can't cities turn their lights out or turn their lights down? And so we've had great benefits from working with large stakeholders who are in return for sort of helping us with the birds, they're saving money, right? Because they're turning their lights off, they're conserving energy and so forth. So we're trying to find the sweet spot with where and how we manage our communities and our buildings and our human built environments with the needs of the birds. And in order to do that, we have to know what birds are there. We have to know when they're there. We have to know when they're moving, et cetera, et cetera. You can see where I'm going. So this is a little bit more of a bigger picture, but for those of you that are really into birds, really understanding them from their whole ecology perspective is going to move us in the direction of where we need to be to bring the birds back. So that was a lot. I hope I didn't overwhelm you too much. The presentation and the slides I will make available, so you are welcome to go back to this. But just in quick summary, plant natives, plant natives, plant natives. I can't say it enough. Lean into that if at all possible in your communities when you're shopping for plants. You have power as a consumer. Ask those nurseries, where are your natives? Why don't you have natives? Is this a wild type native or is this a native-R, right? We have to use that power and ask those questions. Know your birds, right? Get to know them. You might be surprised what you find, and you might have more diversity than you realize once you start really paying attention. And protect those windows. If you have windows, especially if you notice that there's collisions happening, and especially during migration, get those decals up, paint them with a pretty scene, protect those birds. And then certainly, most certainly turn the lights out, especially if you work in a big city. How fun would it be to get your boss to agree to turn the lights out during migration and to be able to present the data to show that the birds are indeed moving, whether we're paying attention or not. And if we really make a concerted effort on a large scale to do these kinds of things, I have no doubts that we will indeed be able to bring the birds back and bend that curve that we are trying to bend. And that is my talk tonight. If we're going to do some Q&A and I will hang out, but if you don't get your question asked, that is my email, rbr75@cornell.edu, and you are more than welcome to reach out to me. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in tonight.
Great. Thank you so much, Becca. That was fascinating. I know I learned a lot, and we've got a bunch of questions in the chat to carry us through here. So let me just start off with the first one. How does climate change impact the losses and gains to birds in our environment?
It's a real big question in lots of different ways, right? I mean, that's really the answer. And kind of like the plants, you really kind of have to look at that on an individual species level. And we don't have all the answers. That is one of the big questions that's driving a lot of researchers right now using that ebird database in particular, and hopefully this nest record database that I am working on too. The short answer is it depends. I'll give you just a couple real concrete examples. On the West Coast, we are seeing some shifts and changes in our hummingbirds population. Climate change is causing a lot of the Pacific Northwest and some parts of Canada and even Southern Alaska to have more mild winters. And so hummingbirds in particular, Anna's hummingbirds, are staying further north. Many of them are not migrating anymore, and they're leaning into nectar resources that people are putting out, and sometimes just flowering plants that are able to linger longer because of the warmer weather. So these Anna hummingbirds are staying around, and then some of the other hummingbirds that are still truly migrating, like some of the rufous hummingbird, Allen hummingbird, they're having competitive impacts with these Annas that are sort of expanding their range and being really successful. And so we're actually seeing declines in rufous hummingbirds and Allen hummingbirds and an increase in the Annas. So, you know, different species will be able to adapt to climate in different ways, and that will ultimately have impacts on the other birds and the other organisms that share habitat with them. So that's a real concrete example, but there is no doubt that climate change is helping some and hurting others. And we're seeing that really on a species by species level.
Interesting. Thanks, Becca. Next question we have for you. An industrial sized solar farm, around 200 acres, will be erected in my rural community. What can we do to protect the birds?
Yeah, that is a really good question. And I will admit that I am not an expert on the impacts of solar on birds. I have not done a lot of research on that. So I'm not going to say that I have expertise in it. However, I will say that I do know that there's a lot of habitat things that big solar farms can do. Some of them do it, some of them don't. But you can plant a lot of native, usually it'll just come up on its own, but plant native plants underneath those solar farms, so that even if the birds can't necessarily utilize higher shrubs and trees that might be growing there, they can still forage on especially the seed heads that are growing underneath those. And birds are pretty smart. They hit windows because the windows look like trees and clouds, like the pictures that I showed you. They don't generally fly right into a solar panel because it generally doesn't look like that, especially since it's like this and not like this, right? And so in terms of collision and impact, I wouldn't be as concerned about a solar system, but certainly trying to make sure that that solar system is still encouraging native habitat in the ways that it can would be what I would advocate for.
Thanks. That's good to know. And I think that question is probably going to be coming up in a lot of other neighborhoods as well.
Absolutely.
So the next question, which I think is another question a lot of people have, is about mowing. So I didn't brush hog my field last year, but I need to do it this season. I know there are ground nesting birds in the spring. When should I cut back my field? And this is someone who's right here in the Hudson Valley.
I am so glad that question is being asked, because if we could manage all of our fields appropriately, we would be doing a huge wealth of good for birds. I'm going to use my area because it's very similar to yours. We're not that far off from each other in terms of mowing recommendations. So the best thing to do is to leave your fields up through the winter, right? Because of all those seed heads and all of the insects that are actually hunkered down in the rods of your drying native plants. You guys are probably familiar with the galls on goldenrod that are housing insects over the winter. So leave those up. And then once the weather starts to hit, and usually this happens where I am in about April, when we're starting to get kind of 50-degree nights, a couple of them in a row, and the daytime isn't as important as the nighttime, but about 50 degrees. Usually that happens in April. I always have usually a week where things just all of a sudden become spring, and then usually it cools down again. But once that snap happens, go ahead and cut your fields back at that time, because the insects will have hatched, right? And then most of the seed heads have pretty much been stripped at that point. And even if they haven't been stripped, the birds can still kind of come in after you cut it back and continue to forage and utilize it. So cut it back then, and then again, let it grow, let it go through the season. Don't cut it back in the fall. If you are managing for livestock, so you really need to cut. If you can manage it, wait in this region until the first week of August. I have a gentleman who does mow my fields for his cows. We have a reciprocal beneficial relationship, but he is not permitted to cut my fields until August 1st. And if you do that, your meadowlarks, your bobolinks, of which I am proud to report have not the meadowlarks because I haven't seen them in a long time, but the bobolinks are skyrocketing around here. And it's because I am being really particular about how I manage my grassland areas. So that would be my recommendation for those of you that have large grassland plots.
Very informative answer, and I think it'll inform a lot of folks in our area with larger fields. So thank you for that.
Sure.
The next question that comes in is hybrid plants do not do the work native plants do, but does color factor in? For example, pink turtle head instead of white, just as effective? Question mark.
Awesome. Pink turtle, but so yeah, the turtle heads do produce pink and white. I do have both of them on my property, and they are both utilized. Color, sometimes color influences what will feed on them, right? So hummingbirds will feed on all colors of flowers, but they do like red and pinks. So sometimes you will just have maybe more foraging activity for species that are really color dependent. For the most part, when it comes to bees, not so much butterflies, but bees, size and shape of the flower itself is more important than the color. So our native bees need sort of usually smaller flowers, and often kind of almost like the columbine shape, where it's a little bit more like a trumpet grower. There are other, like honeybees are pretty generalistic, and they can actually get in some of the smaller, more, the word is evading me right now, but more of like the teardrop kind of shaped flowers. So color, not as much, shape of flower. And so really having a diversity of native flower shapes, and diversity in color is a bonus, but really shape is going to influence what you can attract and support.
Oh, that's great to know. There's so many different flower shapes.
There are. It's endless.
Now, here's a question having to do with the nesting season. This is someone who says they leave their perennial stems into the spring because the orioles strip the swamp milkweed stems to build their nests.
Awesome.
And as a follow-up to that, are there other plants that are providing nesting materials that people might want to focus on in their plantings?
Yeah, that is a really good question. So this depends a little bit on who you ask. Leaving them is fabulous. And I do leave a lot of my stuff standing. The areas that I really want to get the debris out so that the perennials can kind of have a really good jump start to grow. First of all, I wait for that span of time where it's about 50 degrees at night. That's really critical. And then in terms of the nesting material, I will frequently, instead of cut and remove, I will cut and I will leave some. And so therefore the birds can kind of come in, even though it's not necessarily standing upright, it's still available on the ground and they can still come in and shred and use what they need to. So that would be my recommendation. If you see your birds really actively utilizing it, but you're kind of anxious about making way for that new growth, cut it and leave it. And if you can't leave it right where it is, find another spot, maybe a little sandy area or a grassy area, and just leave it. And your caller is, or the listener is 100% correct. The birds will come and find it and utilize it.
Just another kind of recycling.
That's right.
That's awesome. The next question, I think this was when you were just started talking about lots of native plants and how they support birds and bugs. So will squirrels negatively affect any of these plants?
Squirrels. Not so much squirrels, except that they might eat the seeds, right? So they, just like at bird feeders, they might outcompete the birds for the seeds because they will eat the seeds of a lot of these same plants that the birds will. What you may find troubles more with are voles. So your ground diggers, and most of that damage will happen in the winter and the early spring, unfortunately, when these plants are trying to bust out of the ground and start anew. So you might experience some digging up of the root systems there, digging out of bulbs that they like to eat. Not so much squirrels per se, but more of your sort of vole family.
Thank you.
Okay, now here's a reference to that, the planned garden that you had the illustration for. They're just wondering do you have a plant list for that garden that had the IDs with the letters on them?
I do, and that garden was planned for Massachusetts. So most of those plants recommendations, not all of them, but most of them are probably relevant to this area. And I do, so the planting palette that I showed went with that landscape. So I do have both of them. If you want me to send that to you, I didn't send that to you, Julie and Brian, but I'm happy to send it to you if you'd like.
Okay, yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure.
All right. Next question. When it came in, I said yes, because this is a question that I had. It's a personal question for you, Becca. How much time per week in general have you spent to create your garden since 2018?
Oh my God, what a good question.
Do you have a spreadsheet quantifying your?
Is my boss on this call? No. No, I'm very conservative with my work time because I love my job. Well, to be quite honest, I won't lie. So I am a very aggressive organic vegetable grower, and I sustainably grow food for my family, and I grow for one other family, and this year I'm growing for two. So I grow a lot of food, and then I also grow a lot of native landscape in and around those food gardens. So I spent way more time in my vegetable garden than I do in my native plant gardens, because as you saw in those pictures, that particular one that I shared, I established in 2018, and it just is more dense and more rigorous every year, to the point where now I have to kind of be thinning, right? And I have friends that I'm constantly giving native plants to. So it doesn't take much time to maintain native gardens. You just have to kind of be controlling how big and spready and so forth that they're getting. So if I had to give you a rough estimate, I'll give you a week estimate. In the peak kind of growing season, I probably spend anywhere from an hour to 2 on the weekends in my native gardens, and more than double that in my vegetable gardens. So a lot less maintenance in those native gardens than in your vegetable patches.
That's good to know. It's a lot of effort. It reminds me of one of my favorite song lyrics. When you work for Mother Nature, you get paid by Father Time.
Yes,
It's worth putting in the time in the long run. Now, here's a question about the Great Backyard Bird Count and the logistics of it. Is it better to use eBird or Merlin for the Great Backyard Bird Count? Is it better to save the data to my account on one or the other of those apps?
Good question. Either is fine. So it's really your preference. Where do you want to enter your data? So the limitations of Merlin are you can't tell us how many. You can just tell us that you saw that particular bird on that particular day and that particular time. And in our sort of data world, that translates to what's called an incidental sighting, which means that we know that species of bird is in this area at that time of year. And that's valuable data. We can't do as much with that data sometimes as you can with amounts, but it is still very important data. So if you like Merlin, that data is important. We utilize it in the research in which we can utilize it in. If you want to get into more of the nitty gritties of numbers of birds and create lists and be able to see your lists grow over time and have your life list grow and so on and so forth, eBird is a really great tool and option for you. eBird is not as user-friendly. There's a little bit of learning curve with using eBird, and your listeners who have used them, I see Julie shaking her head, know that that is true. So if you're brand new to GBVC, I think stick with Merlin. And then if you really like it and you get hooked, eBird might be the next step for you.
We just dove into eBird here at Duchess Land Conservancy during we have a little weekly walk program. And I gotta say, even though I'm not that knowledgeable with birds, I think that combining the two has worked. Looking at Merlin to identify the bird, then entering the bird list in Merlin ID.
That's a really good
eBird.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. And I didn't say this, but we should say it. If you have eBird mobile on your phone and Merlin, it's seamless. So you can immediately drop your Merlin ID into an eBird list right there on your phone. So I 100% agree with you, Brian. I apologize I didn't say that, but working together.
No worries. It's my novice experience. Thank you. Thank you. So next question is feeding of birds via plants and insects is best, but putting out bird feeders with seed in the summer months, would that be a neutral or a negative?
Really good question. This is a really important question that we've been trying to answer using a lot of our Project Feeder Watch data. For those of you who are familiar with that project, it's really specific to bird feeders in particular, and it runs from November to April. So we don't have a lot of summer data, which is one of the reasons why answering that question using any kind of scientific study is a little hard. But what I can tell this listener is that there isn't any evidence in terms of the research that's been done that feeding birds is having a negative effect on them. Generally speaking, birds that are visiting feeders, whether it's in the winter or the summer months, are doing fine. The one exception to that are birds that can contract diseases from feeders, right? So eye finch disease is an example. There was also a salmonella outbreak that happened this last year. And anytime sort of disease outbreaks happen, you want to pay attention to that and take your feeders down immediately and clean them and leave them down until your cooperative extensions and such in the area tell you that you know it seems to have passed. So the good news is feeding birds doesn't harm them. The only hesitation there is if there is outbreaks, and then you just want to be very careful. Personally, I don't feed birds in the summer. I really try to let my habitat feed them. And I've had really good luck with that. So I only feed my birds in the colder winter months when I feel like, it's really fun to have them close to the house. And B, I know that I am providing some extra calories for them.
Yeah, good to know. I also have been enjoying the bird feeder outside my window when I work at home.
Yeah. So
Now,
lovely.
here's a question about hummingbird feeders. Should you continue your hummingbird feeder once you have started planting natives? And is there a certain number of plants you need before you stop feeding with that hummingbird feeder?
That's a really good question. This is a little bit personal dependent too. Like hummingbird feeders, you can hang right in front of your windows, right? So even if you've got your native resources up for them, and you still want to be able to see them close because they're hard to see. They're just so fast and furious when they're feeding. Keep your hummingbird feeder up. The one word of caution there is that the warmer months, and those of you that live in this region where it gets very hot and humid, that sugar water goes bad fast. And so you really need to be on top of changing the sugar water in your hummingbird feeders if you choose to leave them up after you have established your summer flowers that are feeding them. So generally we recommend every 3 to 5 days, empty that sugar water out no matter what, scour it, clean it, and then put a fresh batch of sugar water in it. Sugar water can, if it goes bad, can kill hummingbirds. It can be very bad for them. So you could have that adverse effect if you're not actually paying attention and just sort of letting your sugar water run low. So do both. I don't think there's anything wrong with that as long as you're really watching your hummingbird feeder. But I will say it's super fun. I do this myself. I don't hummingbird feed because I just don't trust myself to remember every 3 to 5 days. I have a pretty busy life. So instead I just take my lawn chair and I will go out and I will just sit and I will just watch them. And I kind of move my chair around depending on what's blooming and what they're going for. So I don't leave mine up in the summer.
It sounds much more meditative than remembering to change your sugar water every 3 to 5 days.
I agree.
All right. Next question. I thought I had an answer to this in my brain, and then I just kind of second guessed it. But during the winter time, do birds need a water source or can they just eat snow?
Great question.
Right?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I have chickens and they eat snow, but I've never seen a wild bird eat snow. They need fresh water. They need fresh open water. And so that would be, I should have had that in this presentation and I didn't. I'll have to make a note to go back and add that. Water is probably even more important than anything else. We all need it. Birds are no different. And so if you can manage an open water source that doesn't freeze in the wintertime, you're going to go a long way to really helping to support birds. So yes, water, 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 and you will get different species at your water. You can pull in warblers. You can pull in hawks. I've seen hawks bathe in bird baths. So water is really important. And yes, put it out. And if you can keep it from freezing, do so. That's very hard to do in our climate. You can do a very low cost drip system, but even that will freeze in the weather that we've been having lately. You can do heated water baths. They do exist. They do require electricity. I don't have any recommendations for a solar system because the one that I used wasn't effective. So I'm really hesitant to recommend a small solar kind of water bath system, but the electric ones tend to work pretty well.
Okay, that's good to know. So here's a specific question about a bald cypress tree. So some person has a bald cypress tree and noticed that late last winter or in the early spring, before the tree leafed out, cedar waxwings appeared to be feeding on the branch material. What were they eating?
That's interesting. I don't know what they were eating, to be honest. I'd have to look at it. There could have been some insect activity happening there. Cedar waxwings are mostly fruit eaters, but they will eat insects. So perhaps there was some kind of an insect thing that they were going after. There could have been some nutrient thing that they were dealing with. Maybe they were struggling to get, vitamin C or some kind of a mineral compound, and they were able to sort of strip I know that birds will do that. They will strip leaves off of plants and sometimes stems to get some kind of a mineral that they're after. But I am not 100% sure what they were going after. Those would be my guesses, but I don't know for sure.
All right, the next question came in. I'm guessing around something you were discussing, and I can't place the question with what you were probably discussing. Maybe the two of you can help me. It's like a mystery for us. Can you offer specific dates surrounding the spring and fall migration period?
For specific dates in terms of, I'm assuming this person's talking about maybe making efforts to protect windows or help the bird, I think.
Let's go for it. Sounds good to me. It came in at 7:09, if that's any help.
09. Okay. Probably towards the end of the presentation. So Birdcast, I'm going to lean into the tool because I am not a master of exact timing for migration, but I would highly recommend this person to check out Birdcast. What's cool about Birdcast is it has, so as long as these radio towers have been in existence, we've been able to go back and analyze that data. And so, we sometimes have back, depending on how old the radio or the radar station is, 40 years of data. And we've been able to analyze that to know when birds are moving. So we can actually project out and anticipate when big migrations are happening using that data. So that listener, please check out Birdcast. Look at your location and look at the projections out. That said, in general, we see pretty big migrations in New York in early May. That is one of the reasons why the big days happen in early May, because there's a lot of movement happening then. So the first 2 or 3 weeks of May, even the last week of April, is big movement time in our region. And then in terms of the fall, it's a little bit more of a sprinkle. But you sometimes will get birds starting to move in August, more so in later September, and then certainly in that first week of October in our area. So late September, October, you're going to see a lot of movement. And like I said, due to how birds sort of do their orienting, which I just find fascinating that birds can orient as well as they do. We generally have a little more diversity of migration in the fall where we live compared to the spring. But Birdcast, use it, lean into it. And it's really fun because you can use it and figure out maybe like if there's a storm system moving in, there might be a bird fallout. And so you might get a lot of birds if there's a cold or a warm front coming through in your area. And you can, again, sort of combine your love of birding with sort of paying attention to these tools to help you predict what you might see and when you might see it.
Wow, that data is just incredible, what you can do with that.
Amazing.
So we've had a couple comments typed in about the water question. So one person has observed their wild birds eating snow.
Oh, cool. Fun.
And another person is recommending a dog water dish that works great, but make sure you place objects such as rocks in it so the birds can perch and drink without fear of getting wet and freezing.
Very good. That's a very good point. And though not relevant to right now, this is relevant in the summer. Always make sure that you have sticks and rocks in your water in the warmer months, because you will become an ecological trap for pollinators that will also use the water and then be unable to get out of the water. So if you have sticks and rocks in there, your bumblebees is what I see the most, and native bees will be able to escape your water dish instead of sort of creating a water dish that they can't get out of. So important for pollinators and birds. Very good point.
Now we have gone a little bit past 7:30 and there are still a handful of questions left. Should we stay on and see how many we can get through?
Sure, I'm happy to.
5 or so left. Okay. All right, so the next one is that if you want to supplement your native plants with birdseed or mealworms, is there a negative to doing that? Like, for example, do birds get dependent on that food source?
That's a good question. So Nestwatch has done some research on mealworms and offerings to birds. And similarly to feeding birds, there's not a huge amount of support to say that mealworms are bad. Birds are, we always have to remember birds are incredibly smart, right? And they have evolved in our in their habitats for many generations. And if a food source is available today, they'll use it, especially if it's easy. And if it's not tomorrow, then they're going to be creative and find other ways. So I don't know of any particular resource or research that's been done that says any kind of supplemental feeding, whether it's mealworms or other things, makes birds dependent. It does sometimes influence the clutch. So I believe, though I have not read the paper recently, but I believe there is some evidence that mealworms sometimes help with heavier young. So maybe bluebirds young are a little bit thicker and weigh a little bit more if they're available, readily available versus not. The word of caution I would give you there, though, is that I would much rather have the birds feeding on caterpillars and moths from my gardens rather than feeling like I needed to provide mealworms, right? Because they're very similar in terms of what they're calorically going to do for birds. So I that's the best that I can answer in terms of what the research tells us.
All right. Speaking of worms, I bet this next question can open up a can of them. Sorry, good. Does the decrease in bee populations at all impact bird populations?
Bee population? Sorry.
Does the decrease in bee populations at all impact bird populations?
Good question. The evidence tells us that the insect declines are very much aligned with bird declines, right? And so that goes for all insects, and bees are one of them. Not all birds will eat bees, right? They're depending on the bird species. Our native bees are actually consumed quite a bit because they generally don't sting. Many of them do have stingers, some of them don't have stingers. And so native bees are actually consumed by birds, probably more so than honeybees. And honeybees, your listeners probably know, are not native, right? Honeybees were introduced and are introduced, but have been here a long time and are a big part of our landscape. So yes, certainly, if you have a decline in insects, you are going to see a decline in birds, and that goes for bees as well as many, many other insects, which is one of the reasons why, again, if you're going to do natives, first of all, you don't need it, but it is really important as a gardener to really not use any kind of chemical in and around your plants that could affect insect populations. Just avoid it, put it away. I had an invasion of viburnum beetles on my American cranberry this spring. I was very devastated. I hadn't learned yet how to manage for them, and I have learned that now, so I'm trying to get ahead of it this year. But I was really anxious and tempted to do something about it, and I just waited. And I kid you not, the birds flew in. They found those larvae and they did the job for me. So one of the benefits here is if we can really trust and lean into creating an ecological system in our properties, it will balance itself for the most part. And so though I did have some damage, I didn't have as much because the birds were able to kind of move in and help me with it.
Mm-hmm. It's good to have the birds eat them so you don't have to eat them yourself.
Yes.
Now, here's a question about bullying. Any thoughts on house sparrows? They have moved in and I watch them harass my wrens in their nest.
Yes, house sparrows are tough. So I will plug Nest Watch here. They do have a website that they give some really specific examples and recommendations for house sparrows. It's hard. I'm more in the camp of less intervention than more, but I am not always, that's not always the audience, right? There are some people who, specifically people that have nest boxes that they're monitoring and they're trying to attract bluebirds and so forth, that will be more aggressive with house sparrows. Just for your listeners to know, it is illegal to mess with birds, especially nesting birds. And, obviously you have to get caught or be reported, but it is against the law to tamper with them. So my biggest recommendation is to try and have a lot of options. I have a friend who's got a feeder in her front yard. that she keeps full. And then she has some different tube-like feeders and hopper feeders in the back that the sparrows, for whatever reason, don't use. And so she's got kind of the front yard for the house sparrows and the backyard for the other birds. And that is kind of trying to provide multiple foraging opportunities, might help to minimize some of that competition. Easier to do with a bigger piece of land than smaller, but I hate to say it, I'm in the camp of less intervention than more. And that said, there is solid evidence that house sparrow numbers are super declining. So for those of you that don't like house sparrows, they are on the decline, as are European starlings. And not surprising, right? This is what happens with invasive, well, not all invasives, as we know with plants, but in these two cases, these birds are relatively new. They haven't been on the scene that long. They've had huge exponential growth, and now that growth is starting to slow, and we're actually starting to see declines.
Very interesting. There's a question that I feel like could go down another rabbit hole, but how do you grow a native garden when deer are rampant?
I love this question. I get this all the time. So my funny answer is have a dog, a really good barker. I used to have two. I now only have one. But that honestly, and I know we can't all have dogs, but they will keep most things away from in and around your properties. Now, if you can't have a dog, the other best option, as you got a little bit of a sense from my garden pictures, if you are planting densely and as big as these plants can get, a little bit of deer foraging is not going to be very noticeable. And that is very true. I let my deer nibble, my deer nibble back my 9-bark shrub. They love my 9-bark. I don't know why, but they actually prune it. And then the next year it flowers more beautifully. But I have a very big space where I have allowed that kind of natural pruning to occur. And so it does happen. I will tell you that deer are much more attracted to what I call mulch island landscaping. So you get a nice shrub and you plant it and you surround it by a whole lot of mulch, and it just sits there out in the open like a giant ice cream cone waiting to be consumed. The deer notice it and they forage on it. If you do the same, but instead of having the mulch, you put a bunch of different plants in and around that shrub, you would be surprised that it won't get predated on as much by deer, because they're kind of thrown off by the other foliage. They might like something else that's growing instead of the shrub and so forth. So really trying to grow densely, if you can't have a dog, and grow a lot of it will really help minimize even noticing the kind of deer damage. And then a very last, put protection around them. I just moved something that was right next to my house further out from the house, and I did notice the deer started to nibble on it. It's not big enough yet to have that "I'm so big, you're not going to kill me" effect. And so I put a protective fence around it, and I will keep that fence around it probably for 2 or 3 growing seasons until it's outpaced the deer.
Outpacing the deer, that is the challenge I think many of us face.
Yeah.
So we're down to our last couple of questions here. And this one you've talked about already a little bit with the house sparrows. But how can we discourage non-native birds and encourage native birds like bluebirds to nest on our property? Any suggestions in terms of plants and shrubs and nesting locations that would help?
Yeah, so this is kind of a species specific question. With bluebirds, I'll answer that because they specifically put bluebirds in there. One of the ways that you can help bluebirds and any cavity nesting species is to make sure that there are cavities available for them to be in. And house sparrows will try and use them too, but you would be surprised. Bluebirds, Carolina wrens, house wrens, they're vicious, and tree swallows, oh, incredibly. And so having a lot of cavity nesting options available to the birds will help during nesting season and throughout. So each of these different birds have different size openings that they need. So Nest Watch is another great tool. Reference that. You can look up what kind of nest box or birdhouse is another term for the idea of a nest box, that the birds need in order to successfully raise young. This is all if you don't have enough trees that they can sort of naturally be nesting in. And bluebirds are a secondary cavity nester. So they need woodpeckers or sapsuckers to create holes before they can actually nest. They can't make those holes themselves. So if you don't have a lot of dead trees or trees that have these cavities in them, you can put up nest boxes, and that will help your population of any kind of a cavity nester. And then when it comes to house sparrows, there are, well, no, that's starlings. I was going to say there are some special protections that you can put around some of the cavity holes to discourage starlings. I don't think I know of any relevant to house sparrows, but just having lots of nesting opportunities in the form of the nest boxes that the native species need will help the populations long-term outcompete your non-native and invasive birds.
Cool. So we have one more question, it looks like right now. And you kind of discussed this when we talked about the hog field in Hudson Valley here. But this person's question is coming from central New Jersey, and they're looking for, is there a time of year to mow a field for natives in central New Jersey? Looking to mow in thirds over a 3-year period, but I want to do the best time of year with birds and caterpillars in mind.
So I think they're asking like, so in thirds, I'm not, does that mean they
Seems
want
like three times a year they want to mow is what I'm gathering from it.
I think what they want to do is mow once a year, a third of the field each year on a 3-year rotation. That's what I'm reading from that question.
We're detectives. I like it.
Okay. If I'm understanding the question correctly, it would be the same recommendation for up here. New Jersey, you're a little bit further south, so you might have a little bit of a later nesting season. Generally speaking, we say after April, oh my gosh, no, don't do it in April. After August 1st, you're pretty safe. Usually birds will have successfully gotten at least a couple of clutches in by then. And for Jersey, you know, if you could push it into August 15th, bonus, right? Get it a little bit later. So the later, the better is generally the answer. If you need to mow it for, you know, for foraging, right? If you don't need to mow it for foraging, same thing applies. Leave it up. Don't mow it down until the springtime after we've had a span in your area. And this is where you can go area dependent. It'll probably be earlier for you than it is up here, you know, maybe late March instead of early to mid-April. But wait for that span in the spring where things snap and it's about 50 degrees for 3 nights or so. And then you can cut it back because most of the pollinators and stuff are gonna have hatched. The birds are not quite generally into nesting at that point, but they're also not actively looking and building nests at that point. So you're not gonna necessarily disturb early nesting at that time either. If I answered that correctly, I think that was how it was asked. And then do the same thing for each third, just whichever third you're on, follow that same protocol.
It confirmed, yes, that's what they were asking. we did it.
We interpreted correctly. Well done.
Thank you, Beverly.
All
Well,
right.
You did 33 questions in just over 40 minutes. So congratulations, Becca.
Wow.
I think
really?
we can let you go with that with that rate of accomplishment.
Awesome.
You're free to go.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Julie and Brian. This has been a delight, and I love talking about this. I really could talk about it all night.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. I think we all learned a lot. We've been getting a lot of great feedback in the Q&A. And I just want to let everyone know in the next few days, we'll be sending out a follow-up email to everyone who registered that'll have a list of the links and many of the resources that Becca mentioned in her talk, along with a video recording of this presentation. And, you know, since you mentioned Doug Talamy's presentation so many times, I think we'll probably put in a video of his presentation as well, just so people can go back to that if they haven't seen it. And remind everyone that our presentation next month will be featuring Joyce Tomaselli from Cornell Cooperative Extension here in Dutchess County. And she's going to be talking about managing invasive species. So how to learn what you have around your house, pick your battles, and do that difficult management. I know invasives have come up a lot in all of these presentations, so I expect that to be very informative and very well received. So
Great.
thank you all so much. Any closing words, Brian or Becca?
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. It was fun.
Great.
Yeah, was fun. Plant native this spring. Go big.
Yeah, spring is right around the corner, everyone.
Really
It's not far away.
Great.
Thank you.
All right,
Good night.
Thanks, Becca. Good night. Thanks, everyone.